The iron stove weighed 300 pounds if it weighed an ounce, and Jacob Thorne stood at the bottom of the steepest hill in all of Colorado Territory, staring up at the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands where his new bride waited, wondering if love could truly make a man strong enough to carry the impossible. It was the summer of 1876, and the gold rush had brought thousands of hopeful souls to these mountains, but Jacob had come for different reasons entirely. He had left his family's farm in Missouri after the war, seeking solitude in the high country where the air was thin and clean, where a man could forget the things he had seen and done. For 5 years, he had lived alone in his cabin, perched on the side of Mount Evans, trapping and hunting, trading furs in the small town of Georgetown below. He had grown accustomed to silence, to the company of pine trees and mountain lions, to the bitter cold of winter and the brief, brilliant summers when wildflowers painted the meadows in colors so vivid they seemed unreal. Then he had met Margaret. She had arrived in Georgetown on a Thursday afternoon in late May, stepping down from the stagecoach with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a look of determination that had caught his attention immediately. Jacob had been in town selling pelts, his long dark hair tied back with a leather cord, his broad shoulders straining against the homespun shirt he wore. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms thick as most men's legs from years of chopping wood, hauling water, and wrestling traps. His hands were calloused and scarred, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes were a startling clear blue that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. He had noticed her standing in front of the general store, clearly lost, and something in his chest had tightened in a way he did not understand. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and a spray of freckles across her nose that made her look younger than she likely was. Her dress was neat but faded, mended in several places with careful stitches, and she held herself with a straight-backed pride that spoke of hardship faced and overcome. Jacob had surprised himself by walking over to her. He was not a man given to conversation, especially not with women. But something pulled him forward, some force he could not name. "You look like you might need some help," he had said, his voice rough from disuse. She had turned those green eyes on him, wary at first, then softening slightly. "I'm looking for the boarding house," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, with a hint of an Eastern accent. "I was told there was one near the church." "That would be Mrs. Henderson's place," Jacob replied. "2 streets over, white house with blue shutters." He paused, then added, "I can show you if you like." She had studied him for a long moment, taking in his size, his rough appearance, the knife at his belt, and the rifle slung across his back. He had expected her to refuse, to thank him politely and hurry away. Instead, she nodded. "That would be very kind of you, Mr. Thorne. Jacob Thorne." "Margaret Brennan," she said, shifting her carpet bag to her other hand. He had reached for it without thinking. "Let me carry that for you." She hesitated, then allowed it. The bag was heavier than it looked, and he wondered what she carried inside. They walked in silence at first, Jacob acutely aware of the curious stares from the townspeople. He rarely came down from the mountain, and when he did, he kept to himself. To see him walking with a strange woman was gossip worthy indeed. "Are you visiting family in Georgetown?" he asked, trying to fill the awkward quiet. "No," Margaret said. "I'm here to work. I answered an advertisement for a school teacher." Jacob looked at her with new respect. "We have been needing a teacher. Last one left 2 years back when she married a miner and moved to Denver." "So I was told," Margaret replied. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I hope the children here are not too wild." "They are mountain children," Jacob said. "They know how to survive, but book learning has been scarce. You will have your work cut out for you." They had reached the boarding house, and Jacob set her bag down on the porch. Mrs. Henderson, a round woman with sharp eyes and a kind heart, had opened the door before they could knock. "You must be Miss Brennan," she said warmly. "We have been expecting you. Come in, come in." Then she noticed Jacob. "Why, Jacob Thorne, I have not seen you in months. Are you well?" "Well enough, madam," Jacob said, touching the brim of his hat. "I was just helping Miss Brennan find her way." Mrs. Henderson's eyes gleamed with speculation. "How very kind of you." She ushered Margaret inside, but before the door closed, Margaret turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," she said, and the smile she gave him made his heart do a strange flip in his chest. He had walked back to his horse, telling himself he would not think about her again, that she was a town woman with education and refinement, and he was a hermit who had forgotten how to live among people. But he found himself returning to Georgetown the following week, ostensibly to buy supplies, though his cabin was well stocked. And the week after that. And the week after that. Margaret had started teaching in the small schoolhouse, and the children adored her. Jacob would sometimes sit on his horse at the edge of town, watching her lead them out for afternoon recess, her laughter carrying on the wind. He felt like a fool, a grown man of 30 acting like a lovesick boy, but he could not seem to help himself. It was Margaret who finally confronted him. She walked up to him one afternoon as he sat outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her hands on her hips, "are you going to keep watching me from a distance, or are you going to actually speak to me?" He had nearly dropped his knife. I did not." "You were and you did," she said, but her eyes were sparkling with amusement. "I see you every time you come to town. You're not exactly inconspicuous, you know. You're probably the largest man I've ever seen." Heat rose in his face. "I apologize if I made you uncomfortable." "I did not say I was uncomfortable," Margaret said. She sat down beside him on the bench, propriety be damned, apparently. "I said I wanted you to talk to me instead of just staring." So he had talked. Haltingly at first, then with growing ease. He told her about his cabin, about the mountains, about the elk that came to drink from the stream behind his house and the eagle that nested in the tall pine. She told him about her life in Boston, about her parents who had died of fever, about her decision to come west because she had nothing left to keep her in the east. "I wanted to be somewhere new," she said, "somewhere I could start over and be useful." "You are certainly useful here," Jacob said. "Those children are learning more than they ever have." They began meeting regularly after that. Jacob would come to town on Saturdays, and they would walk together, sometimes out to the edge of the settlement where the meadows began, sometimes just up and down the main street. People talked, of course, but Margaret seemed not to care, and Jacob found he did not either. He fell in love with her slowly, and then all at once. It was the way she laughed with her whole body, throwing her head back with pure joy. It was the way she was patient with the slowest student and firm with the troublemakers. It was the way she looked at the mountains with wonder, even after months of living among them. It was the way she looked at him, as if she saw not a rough mountain man, but someone worth knowing, worth caring about. One evening in early September, as the aspen leaves were turning gold and the air had the first bite of autumn, Jacob took her to a spot he had never shown anyone. It was a small clearing high above Georgetown, accessible only by a narrow trail where a waterfall tumbled down smooth rocks into a clear pool. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the mountains stretched out in every direction, vast and ancient. "Jacob," Margaret breathed, turning in a slow circle, "this is the most beautiful place I have ever seen." He stood behind her, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used. "I wanted to share it with you," he said quietly. "I wanted to show you something beautiful." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright. "You show me beautiful things every time I see you." His heart hammered in his chest. "Margaret, I know I am not what you might have hoped for. I am not educated. I am not refined. I live in a cabin on a mountain, and I smell like pine sap and wood smoke. But I love you. I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in front of that store, looking lost and brave at the same time. And if you would have me, I would spend every day of my life trying to make you happy." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Oh, Jacob, I do not want refined. I do not want someone who smells like bay rum and wears a suit. I want you exactly as you are. I love you, too. I think I have from the beginning." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with all the pent-up longing of months of restraint. She melted against him, her arms coming up around his neck, and he felt complete in a way he had never imagined possible. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Georgetown, with Mrs. Henderson and half the town in attendance. Margaret wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that Mrs. Henderson and the other women had helped her make, and Jacob wore new trousers and a shirt he had bought specially for the occasion. His hands shook as he slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he had traded nearly all his furs for, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, he felt as if his chest might burst with happiness. The problem was that Margaret could not live in Georgetown, and he could not leave his mountain. The cabin he had built was his home, the place he had made with his own hands, and he could not imagine abandoning it. But it was also a harsh place, especially in winter, and he worried about bringing Margaret there. She had settled the question herself. "Where you go, I go," she said firmly. "I did not marry you to live apart from you. If you live on a mountain, then I live on a mountain." So he had brought her up the steep trail to his cabin, watching her face anxiously as they approached. The cabin was solid, built of thick logs and chinked carefully against the cold. It had one large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace he had labored over for weeks, and windows he had hauled up piece by piece. It was clean and well maintained, but it was sparse, with only the most basic furnishings. Margaret had walked through slowly, running her hands over the table he had made, the shelves, the bed frame. Then she turned to him with shining eyes. "It is perfect," she said. "It is our home." He had swept her up in his arms, carrying her over the threshold properly, and they had begun their married life together. The first weeks were blissful. Jacob taught Margaret about the mountain, showing her where the best berries grew, how to identify animal tracks, which plants were safe to eat. She was an eager student, fearless in her exploration. In turn, she brought warmth and light to his cabin, hanging curtains she had made, arranging wildflowers in jars, filling the space with her voice as she sang while working. But as the weeks went on, Jacob noticed something. Margaret loved to cook, and she had grand plans for the meals she wanted to make. She talked wistfully about the bread her mother used to bake, about pies filled with apples and cherries, about cakes that rose high and light. But the cabin had only the fireplace for cooking, and while Margaret did her best with a Dutch oven and a tripod over the flames, it was limited. Bread came out dense and uneven. Pies were impossible. The things she wanted to create, the things that would make their house truly feel like a home, were beyond reach. Jacob saw the disappointment in her eyes when another batch of biscuits came out burned on one side and raw on the other. He heard the frustration in her voice when she talked about how her mother's kitchen had a proper stove, how much easier it would have been with even heat and an oven. He said nothing, but he began to plan. Georgetown had a general store that occasionally received shipments of larger goods from Denver. Jacob rode down one afternoon and spoke to Mr. Patterson, the store owner. "I need a cast-iron stove," Jacob said without preamble. "A good one, with an oven. What would it cost?" Mr. Patterson nearly choked on his coffee. "A stove? Jacob, those things weigh hundreds of pounds. How would you even get it up to your place?" "Let me worry about that," Jacob said. "Can you get one?" It took some discussion, but eventually, Mr. Patterson agreed to order a stove from Denver. It would cost Jacob nearly everything he had saved, but he did not hesitate. He made arrangements to have it shipped to Georgetown, and he began preparing for the monumental task ahead. The stove arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered on a freight wagon. Jacob stood looking at it, his hands on his hips, assessing the challenge. It was a beautiful piece, black cast iron with nickel trim, with 4 burners on top and a good-sized oven. It was also, as Mr. Patterson had warned, extraordinarily heavy, 300 pounds at least. "You are out of your mind," Mr. Patterson said flatly. "There is no way you can carry that up your mountain. You will kill yourself." "I will manage," Jacob said. "At least let me lend you a mule," Mr. Patterson offered. "You could rig up some kind of travois." Jacob shook his head. "The trail is too narrow in places and too steep. A mule would never make it with this weight. It has to be carried." He spent that night in Georgetown, making his preparations. He fashioned a special harness out of rope and leather straps designed to distribute the weight across his shoulders and back. He packed supplies and planned his route, deciding to take the longer but slightly less steep trail that wound around the back of the mountain. Before dawn, he began. With the help of 2 men from town, he got the stove secured in his harness, the weight settling onto his shoulders like a yoke. His knees buckled slightly, and pain shot through his back. But he gritted his teeth and straightened. The men looked at him as if he were insane. "At least let us help you get it started," one of them said. "No," Jacob said. "Thank you, but this is something I need to do myself." He took the first step, then another. Each movement was agony. The stove seemed to grow heavier with each yard he covered. By the time he reached the base of the trail that led up the mountain, sweat poured down his face despite the cool morning air, and his muscles screamed in protest. But he thought of Margaret, of the way her eyes lit up when she talked about baking, and he kept moving. The trail was brutal. What would normally take him an hour to climb took the entire morning just to cover the first quarter of the distance. He had to stop frequently, easing the stove down onto boulders or fallen logs to rest his back and shoulders. His breathing came in ragged gasps in the thin mountain air. Several times he nearly lost his footing on loose rocks, and the thought of the stove tumbling down the mountain, all that money and effort lost, drove him to be more careful. The sun climbed higher, beating down on him. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, his legs trembled with exhaustion. But still, he climbed. Halfway up, he encountered a section where the trail narrowed to barely 2 feet wide, with a sheer drop on one side. This was the part he had been dreading. He would have to edge along sideways, the stove making him top-heavy and unbalanced. One wrong move, and he would go over. He said a prayer, something he had not done since he was a boy, and started across. His boots scraped on the rock. The stove swayed with each step, threatening to pull him backward into empty air. He pressed himself against the rock face, moving inches at a time, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. When he finally reached solid ground on the other side, he collapsed to his knees, gulping air. His whole body shook. But he had made it. He allowed himself 10 minutes to rest, then heaved the stove back onto his shoulders and continued. The afternoon wore on. The trail grew steeper as he approached the final approach to his cabin. This was the part that had given the mountain its reputation, a slope so steep that even without a load, men had to use their hands as well as their feet to climb it. With 300 pounds on his back, it seemed impossible. Jacob stared up at it, calculating. His body was already pushed beyond what he thought possible. His shoulders were raw and bleeding beneath the straps. His legs were numb, his lungs burned with each breath. But he could see his cabin now, just a few hundred yards above him. He could picture Margaret inside, perhaps preparing their evening meal, unaware that he was so close. He started up the final slope. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Harder than the war, harder than his first winter alone on the mountain, harder than anything he could have imagined. Several times he thought he would have to give up to ease the stove down and admit defeat. But each time he found some reserve of strength he did not know he possessed, some deep well of determination fueled by love. His vision began to blur. His hands were bleeding from grabbing at rocks and trees to pull himself upward. He could no longer feel his legs, could only trust that they were still moving. And then, impossibly, he was there. The ground leveled out. His cabin stood before him, smoke rising from the chimney. He had made it. He managed 3 more steps before his legs gave out entirely. He collapsed in front of the cabin door, the stove still strapped to his back, unable to move another inch. The door flew open, and Margaret stood there, her eyes wide with shock. "Jacob, oh my God, Jacob, what have you done?" She rushed to him, trying to help him up, but he could not move. "The stove," he managed to gasp, "for you, so you can bake." Her hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She ran around behind him, working frantically at the harness, loosening straps. The weight lifted from his shoulders, and he groaned with relief as the stove settled on the ground. Margaret helped him roll away from it, and he lay on his back, staring up at the sky, every muscle in his body screaming. "You carried a stove up the mountain?" Margaret's voice was choked with emotion. "Jacob, you could have been killed. You could have fallen. You could have—" She could not finish, sobbing too hard. He reached up with a shaking hand to touch her face. "You wanted to bake," he said simply. "You wanted to make pies and bread, to have a real kitchen. I wanted to give you that." "You foolish, wonderful, impossible man," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. She bent and kissed him, tasting the salt of his sweat and her tears. "I love you so much, but do not ever scare me like that again." He smiled weakly. "I promise. Once was enough." She helped him into the cabin, easing him down onto their bed. His body was a mass of pain, but as he watched her fuss over him, bringing water and cloths to clean his wounds, making him drink and checking him over with anxious hands, he felt a deep contentment settle over him. Over the next several days, with the help of 2 men from town whom Jacob had Margaret fetch, they installed the stove in the cabin. It fit perfectly in the corner he had mentally designated for it, the stovepipe running up through a hole he cut in the roof. When they fired it up for the first time, the heat it threw was strong and even, and Margaret stood in front of it with wonder on her face. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Jacob, still recovering from his ordeal, watched from a chair he had pulled up. "It is just a stove." "No," Margaret said firmly. She turned to look at him, her eyes bright. "It is proof that I married the best man in the world, a man who would literally carry a mountain of iron up a mountain of stone just to make me happy." His injuries healed slowly. His shoulders bore scars from the straps that would remain for the rest of his life. But when Margaret baked her first pie in that stove, a perfect creation with a golden crust and filling made from the wild berries she had gathered and preserved, and when she cut him a slice and watched his face as he tasted it, he knew he would do it all again in a heartbeat. The pie was delicious, sweet and tart, the crust flaky and light. But what made it perfect was the joy on Margaret's face, the pride in her eyes, the way she looked at him as if he had given her the world. "It is perfect," he said honestly. "It is," she agreed. "And so are you." That winter was the happiest of Jacob's life. The stove kept the cabin warm even during the worst blizzards. Margaret baked bread twice a week, and the smell of it filled their home with comfort and warmth. She experimented with recipes, making biscuits and cakes, cookies and tarts. She preserved fruits and vegetables, cooked hearty stews and roasts, and turned their simple cabin into a true home. Jacob had never eaten so well. He had never been so content. He would come in from checking his trap lines or chopping wood to find the cabin warm and fragrant, Margaret humming as she worked at her stove, and his heart would swell with love. They grew closer through that winter, learning each other's rhythms, becoming truly one. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing dreams and fears, hopes and memories. Margaret told him about her childhood in Boston, about her strict father and kind mother, about the books she had read and the places she had dreamed of seeing. Jacob told her about the war, things he had never spoken of to anyone, and she held him as he wept for the friends he had lost and the innocence he could never reclaim. "You are a good man, Jacob Thorne," she told him fiercely. "Whatever you had to do in the war, it does not change that. You have the kindest heart of anyone I have ever known." When spring came and the snows melted, revealing the meadows filled with new growth, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told him one morning in late April, her hands nervously twisting her apron as he sat at the table eating the breakfast she had made. "Jacob, I have something to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up immediately, concerned by her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Better than fine, actually. I'm going to have a baby." He stared at her, the words not quite making sense at first. Then their meaning hit him like a physical blow, and he was on his feet, crossing to her in 2 long strides. "A baby? We are going to have a baby?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "In November, I think. Are you happy?" "Happy?" He picked her up, spinning her around gently, his face split by the widest smile she had ever seen. "Margaret, I am happier than I ever thought possible. You are going to be a mother. I'm going to be a father." He set her down carefully, as if she were made of glass. "You should sit down. You should rest. Should you be resting?" She laughed at his sudden anxiety. "Jacob, I am pregnant, not ill. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." But he fussed over her anyway, insisting she not lift anything heavy, worrying about her health. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find, riding to Georgetown to borrow volumes from Mrs. Henderson and the doctor. He prepared for the baby's arrival with the same intense focus he brought to everything, building a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until it was soft as silk. Margaret bloomed with pregnancy. Her face glowed, her eyes sparkled, and despite the morning sickness and the discomfort as she grew larger, she seemed radiantly happy. She sewed tiny clothes, knitted blankets, and prepared the cabin for their child. As summer turned to fall and Margaret's time drew near, Jacob became increasingly anxious. The cabin was far from town, far from the doctor. If something went wrong, he would have no help. The thought terrified him. "I think you should go to Georgetown for the birth," he said one evening in late October. "Stay with Mrs. Henderson where the doctor can reach you easily." Margaret shook her head firmly. "I'm having our baby here, in our home. This is where we belong." But if something happens, then we will deal with it, she said calmly. Jacob, women have been giving birth for thousands of years without doctors. I am strong and healthy. Everything will be fine. He wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in her eyes. So instead, he made sure they were as prepared as possible. He brought Mrs. Henderson up to the cabin a week before the baby was due, bribing her with gold to stay and help with the birth. He stocked the cabin with extra wood and supplies. He boiled water and prepared clean linens. And then they waited. The baby came on a cold November night with snow falling softly outside. Margaret's labor started just after supper, and Jacob felt his heart stop with fear as she gasped and clutched her belly. But Mrs. Henderson took charge, shooing him out of the cabin despite his protests. "This is women's work," she said firmly. "You can chop wood or pace or do whatever men do, but you are not staying in here." So Jacob paced outside in the snow, his hands clenched into fists, listening to Margaret's cries through the cabin walls. Each sound she made felt like a knife to his heart. He had faced enemy soldiers, wild animals, and the worst the mountains could throw at him, but nothing had ever terrified him like this. Hours passed. The snow continued to fall. Jacob prayed to a God he was not sure he believed in, making bargains and promises. Let her be all right. Let the baby be healthy. I will do anything, be anything, give anything. Just let them both survive. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he heard a new sound, a baby's cry, thin and angry and perfect. The cabin door opened and Mrs. Henderson stood there smiling. "You have a son," she said, "a big, healthy boy, and Margaret is fine, tired, but fine. Come and meet your family." Jacob's legs nearly gave out with relief. He stumbled into the cabin, his eyes seeking Margaret immediately. She lay in their bed looking exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she saw him, her face lit up. "Jacob, come meet your son." He crossed to the bed on shaking legs, sitting carefully on the edge. Margaret pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny red face, eyes squeezed shut, a shock of dark hair on his small head. The baby's fists waved in the air, and he made small mewling sounds. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered, reaching out with one large finger to touch the baby's hand. Immediately, tiny fingers wrapped around his, gripping with surprising strength. Something cracked open in Jacob's chest, a flood of love so powerful it left him breathless. "What should we name him?" Margaret asked softly. Jacob thought for a moment. "Daniel, after my brother who died in the war. If that is all right with you." Margaret smiled. "Daniel Thorne. It is perfect." Jacob leaned down and kissed her gently. "Thank you," he whispered, "for him, for everything, for making my life worth living." "We are a family now," Margaret said, her eyes shining with tears. "A real family." Over the next weeks, they settled into the rhythms of life with a new baby. Daniel was a good baby, healthy and strong, though he had a powerful set of lungs when he wanted to use them. Jacob was amazed by how small he was, how fragile, and he handled his son with infinite care, terrified of his own strength. Margaret laughed at his nervousness. "You carried a 300-pound stove up a mountain, but you were afraid of a 7-pound baby." "The stove could not break," Jacob pointed out. "Daniel is precious, irreplaceable." He was a devoted father, waking in the night to bring Daniel to Margaret for feeding, walking the cabin floor with his son when the baby was fussy, singing to him in a deep rumbling voice that seemed to soothe the child. Margaret would watch them together, her heart full to bursting, thinking about how blessed she was. Winter settled in hard that year, with snowdrifts piling up to the cabin's windows and temperatures that made the very air seem to crack with cold. But inside, they were warm and safe. The stove kept the cabin comfortable, and Margaret baked her pies and breads while Daniel slept in his cradle nearby. One evening in January, as they sat together by the fire, Daniel sleeping peacefully and the wind howling outside, Margaret said, "I have been thinking about the school." Jacob looked up from the trap he was mending. "What about it?" "I miss teaching," she admitted. "I know I cannot go back to Georgetown, not with Daniel so small and not with the trail so difficult. But I was thinking, there are other families on this mountain, scattered around. What if we started a school here? Just a few days a week, when the weather is decent. The children could come here, and I could teach them. Jacob considered it. There were indeed several families within a few miles, miners and trappers who had brought wives and children. Their children ran wild with no education, and he knew the parents would welcome the opportunity. "You would be willing to have children here several days a week?" he asked. "I would love it," Margaret said. "I miss the teaching, the feeling of helping children learn. And it would be good for Daniel, too, as he grows, to be around other children." "Then we should do it," Jacob said. "I can spread the word, let the families know. We can set up benches in here, and you can teach just like you did in Georgetown." So that is what they did. When spring came and the trails cleared, Jacob rode around to the scattered homesteads, telling families about Margaret's school. The response was overwhelming. 8 families wanted to send their children, a total of 15 students ranging in age from 5 to 14. Margaret was in her element. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, using whatever books they had and making up lessons where they lacked materials. The children sat on rough benches Jacob had built, bent over slates he had purchased in Georgetown, and soaked up knowledge like dry earth soaking up rain. During the breaks, Margaret would give the children cookies or bread fresh from her stove. They would play outside under Jacob's watchful eye. He found himself enjoying the noise and chaos of children, so different from the quiet he had once craved. Daniel grew quickly, becoming a chubby, happy baby who laughed easily and loved nothing more than being held by his father. Jacob would carry him around the cabin, showing him things and explaining them as if the baby could understand. "This is a pine cone, see? And this is snow. Cold, is it not?" Margaret would laugh, but she loved watching them together, the giant of a man and the tiny child, Jacob's massive hands so gentle, his gruff voice soft when he spoke to his son. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and simple joys. Daniel learned to walk, then to run, and became a fixture in his mother's classroom, sitting quietly in the corner playing with wooden toys Jacob carved for him. When he was old enough, he joined the other students, proving to be bright and curious. Margaret became pregnant again when Daniel was 3. This time, she was less anxious, having been through it before, though Jacob was no less worried. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Margaret's mother, arrived on a warm June evening, her birth much easier than Daniel's had been. Jacob held his daughter for the first time and felt the same overwhelming love he had experienced with Daniel. She was tiny and perfect, with Margaret's green eyes and a rosebud mouth, and he vowed to protect her always. With 2 children and a schoolhouse full of students several days a week, the cabin was no longer quiet. It rang with laughter and arguments, with the sound of lessons being recited and children playing. The stove was constantly in use, Margaret baking for the students, for her own family, for the sheer joy of creating. Jacob expanded the cabin, adding 2 more rooms so the children could have their own spaces. He built Margaret a larger table for her classroom, more benches, shelves for books. Whatever she needed, he provided. The school became known throughout the territory. Families moved to the area specifically so their children could attend. Margaret had to turn students away eventually, unable to handle more than 20 at a time. Jacob's reputation grew as well. He was known as the man who had carried an iron stove up a mountain for love, and the story became legend. People spoke of it in saloons and general stores, embellishing it, until some versions had the stove weighing half a ton and the mountain being climbed in a blizzard. But Jacob did not care about the stories. He cared about the reality of his life, which was richer than he had ever dreamed possible. He had a wife he loved beyond measure, children who brought him joy every day, and a home filled with warmth and purpose. One evening, when Daniel was 10 and Sarah was 7, and Margaret was pregnant with their 3rd child, they all sat around the table eating dinner. It was a simple meal, but delicious, cooked with love on the stove that had started it all. The children chattered about their day, and Margaret smiled as she listened, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Jacob looked around at his family and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was what he had been searching for during all those years alone on the mountain. Not solitude, but connection. Not isolation, but love. Not survival, but life in its fullest sense. "What are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, catching his eye. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Jacob said honestly. "How grateful." She reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers warm in his. "We are all lucky," she said. "You gave me a stove so I could bake pies, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a home, a family, a life I never could have imagined." "You gave me those things too," Jacob said. "Before you, I was just existing. You taught me how to live." Daniel made a face. "Are you two going to be mushy again?" Sarah giggled. "They are always mushy." Margaret and Jacob laughed, and the moment passed into the ordinary flow of family life. But that night, after the children were asleep and they lay together in their bed, Jacob held Margaret close and whispered, "I would do it all again, you know. Carry that stove up the mountain. Every step, every moment of pain. I would do it 1,000 times for you." "I know you would," Margaret murmured, her breath warm against his chest. "That is the kind of man you are. That is why I love you." Their third child, another son they named Thomas, arrived in October. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with serious eyes, and he completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. As the children grew, Daniel showed his father's strength and his mother's intelligence. He learned to trap and hunt from Jacob, to track and survive in the wilderness, but he also loved books and learning, spending hours reading by lamplight. Sarah was more like her mother, loving to cook and bake, spending hours at the stove creating her own recipes. Thomas was the peacemaker, the one who could soothe arguments and make everyone laugh. Jacob taught all three of them about the mountains, about respecting the wilderness and understanding its rhythms. He taught them to shoot, to fish, to read the weather and the signs of animals. But he also taught them kindness, to help their neighbors, to value education, to treat everyone with respect. Margaret continued teaching until the students numbered more than she could handle alone. Then Daniel, when he turned 16, began helping her, teaching the younger children their letters while she worked with the older ones on more advanced subjects. It was a family enterprise, and the whole community benefited. The stove remained the heart of the home. Margaret used it every day, and as Sarah grew older, she began teaching her daughter the secrets of baking: perfect bread, flaky pie crusts, cakes that rose light and high. The recipes passed from mother to daughter, along with stories of the day Jacob carried the stove up the mountain. "Tell me again, Papa," Sarah would beg, sitting at his feet by the fire. "Tell me about carrying the stove." And Jacob would tell the story, though he downplayed the difficulty. "It was not so hard," he would say, though Margaret would snort with laughter. "Not so hard? Jacob Thorne, you collapsed in the doorway and could not move for 3 days. Your shoulders bled and your legs were like jelly." "But it was worth it," Jacob would say, winking at Sarah, "because it made your mother happy, and that makes everything worth it." As the children reached adulthood, they each found their own paths. Daniel married a girl from one of the nearby homesteads, a smart, capable young woman named Emma, who was not intimidated by the mountains or the hard work they required. They built a cabin a mile from Jacob and Margaret's place, close enough to help but far enough for privacy. Sarah, to everyone's surprise, fell in love with a young lawyer who had come to Georgetown to set up a practice. James was from Denver, educated and refined, but he fell completely under Sarah's spell. He proposed within 6 months of meeting her, and though Jacob worried that his daughter would move away to the city, James agreed to make their home in Georgetown, close enough that Sarah could visit her family often. Thomas, the youngest, became a teacher like his mother, taking over the school when Margaret finally decided to retire. He had a gift for reaching difficult students, for making learning exciting, and the school continued to thrive under his guidance. Jacob and Margaret grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. Jacob's hair turned gray, then white, and his body, though still strong, bore the marks of a hard life and the scars from carrying the stove up the mountain. Margaret's auburn hair faded to a soft silver, and lines appeared around her eyes and mouth, but to Jacob, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her stepping down from that stagecoach. They became grandparents, delighting in the children Daniel and Emma produced, in the babies Sarah brought to visit, in the students Thomas taught who called them Grandma and Grandpa. Their cabin was rarely quiet, filled with visitors and family, but they loved it. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Margaret baked pies, dozens of them, using the stove that had started it all. Apple and cherry, peach and berry, each one perfect. the crusts golden and flaky, the fillings sweet and rich. As they sat around the table, surrounded by family, Jacob raised his glass. 25 years ago, I married the most wonderful woman in the world. I was a rough mountain man with nothing to offer but hard work and devotion, and somehow she saw something worth loving. She has given me children and grandchildren, a home filled with joy and more happiness than any man deserves. But I want you all to know, if I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. Well, maybe I would have asked Mr. Patterson to order 2 stoves, so I only had to carry one at a time. Everyone laughed, and Margaret swatted his arm playfully. You old fool, you can barely carry a sack of flour now, and you are joking about carrying stoves? I could still do it if I had to, Jacob protested, though his eyes twinkled. For you, I could do anything. I know you could, Margaret said, her voice soft. She stood and kissed him, and their children and grandchildren cheered. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Jacob and Margaret sat together on the porch of their cabin, looking out at the mountains bathed in moonlight. The air was cool and sweet, filled with the scent of pine, and an owl called somewhere in the darkness. Do you remember the first time I brought you up here? Jacob asked, his arm around Margaret's shoulders. I do, Margaret said. I was terrified the whole way up that trail, convinced I had made a terrible mistake marrying a mountain man. But then I saw the cabin, saw how much care you had put into building it, and I knew I was home. I was terrified too, Jacob admitted, afraid you would hate it, that you would leave and go back to town. I could never leave, Margaret said. Not then, not now, not ever. You are my home, Jacob Thorne. Wherever you are, that is where I belong. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Margaret said, Do you ever regret it, giving up your solitude, your quiet life? Never, Jacob said fiercely. Not for a single second. That was not living, Margaret. That was just waiting. You gave me a reason to live, a purpose. You and the children, this family we have built, that is everything. We have had a good life, Margaret said, leaning her head on his shoulder. The best, Jacob agreed. They sat together watching the stars, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing but love and determination. The stove sat inside the cabin behind them, still functioning perfectly after all these years, still the heart of their home. As the years continued to pass, Jacob's body finally began to fail him. His joints ached with arthritis, his back troubled him from old injuries, and his lungs struggled with the thin mountain air. But his spirit remained strong, and his love for Margaret never wavered. When he was 72 years old, Jacob knew his time was growing short. He sat Margaret down one evening and took her hands in his. I need you to promise me something, he said. Anything, Margaret said, though her eyes were bright with tears. She knew what was coming. When I am gone, I do not want you to grieve too long. I want you to remember the good times, the laughter, the love. I want you to keep baking your pies and teaching and being the incredible woman you are. Jacob, please, he said gently. I have had the most wonderful life any man could ask for, and it is all because of you. But every story has to end, and I want you to promise me that you will be all right when mine does. Margaret was crying openly now. How can I be all right without you? You're my other half, my heart. You are stronger than you know, Jacob said. You came out here alone, remember? You built a life from nothing. You can keep going without me. I do not want to, she whispered. I know, he said, pulling her into his arms. But you will, because that is who you are. Promise me. I promise, she said, though the words broke her heart. Jacob passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, with Margaret beside him and his children gathered around. He simply went to sleep and did not wake up, his face peaceful, his hands still holding Margaret's. The entire community came to his funeral. They buried him on the mountain he had loved, in a spot where he could see for miles, with a headstone that read, Jacob Thorne, beloved husband, father, and friend. He would move mountains for those he loved. Margaret grieved deeply, as she knew she would. The cabin felt empty without Jacob's presence, without his booming laugh and his gentle hands. But she kept her promise to him. She continued to live, to bake her pies, to spend time with her children and grandchildren. She told stories about Jacob, keeping his memory alive, teaching the younger generations about the man who had carried a stove up a mountain for love. On her own 75th birthday, surrounded by her family, Margaret stood in front of the old stove and ran her hands over its surface. It was worn now, the nickel trim tarnished, but it still worked perfectly, still baked perfect pies. "This stove," she said to her assembled family, "represents everything your grandfather was, strong, reliable, and willing to endure anything to provide for those he loved. Every time I use it, I remember him, and I am grateful all over again for the day he decided to carry it up that mountain." She baked one more pie that day, an apple pie made from the recipe her mother had taught her and she had taught Sarah. As she pulled it from the oven, golden and perfect, she thought about all the pies she had baked over the years, all the meals cooked, all the warmth shared, and she thanked God for Jacob, for the stove, for the life they had built together. Margaret lived to be 83 years old, surrounded by love until the very end. When she passed, she was buried next to Jacob on the mountain, her headstone reading, "Margaret Thorne, beloved wife, mother, and teacher. She brought light and warmth wherever she went." The cabin and the stove passed to Thomas, who continued to use it for his own family. The story of how Jacob carried the stove up the mountain became a legend in the territory, told and retold, embellished and remembered. But for those who had known Jacob and Margaret, who had witnessed their love firsthand, no embellishment was necessary. The simple truth was powerful enough. Years later, Daniel's grandson, a young man named Jacob after his great-grandfather, climbed to the old cabin, which was now kept as a sort of family shrine. He stood in front of the ancient stove, still in its place in the corner, and ran his hands over the iron. "Did he really carry this all the way up the mountain?" he asked his grandfather Daniel, now an old man himself. "He did," Daniel said, "every step by himself, because he loved your great-grandmother more than his own comfort, more than his own safety. That is what love is, Jacob. It is doing the impossible because the other person is worth it." Young Jacob thought about that, looking at the stove with new respect. "I hope I find love like that someday." "I hope you do too," Daniel said, "and if you do, hold on to it. Do not let it go. Because love like that, love that would carry a stove up a mountain, that is the rarest and most precious thing in the world." The stove remained in the cabin for generations, a testament to one man's love and one woman's dreams. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines and the stars shone bright over the mountains, it was almost possible to hear the echo of laughter, the scent of fresh-baked pies, and the warmth of a love that had transcended everything, even death itself. Jacob and Margaret's love story became the foundation of their family's legacy. Their descendants carried forward the values they had lived by: hard work, devotion, kindness, and the understanding that love required sacrifice, and that sacrifice made in love was never truly a sacrifice at all. The cabin stood for over 100 years, preserved by the family, until it was eventually donated to the Colorado Historical Society and turned into a museum. The stove was carefully restored and put on display, with a plaque telling the story of the mountain man who had carried it up the steep mountain so his wife could bake warm, sweet pies. Visitors came from all over to see it, to touch the iron, and marvel at the feat of strength and love it represented. Children listened wide-eyed as tour guides told the story. Couples stood in front of it, holding hands, thinking about their own relationships and what they might be willing to do for love. But the real legacy was not in the museum or the plaque. It was in the lives of Jacob and Margaret's descendants, scattered across the country, who carried within them the values and the love story of their ancestors. It was in the way they treated their spouses with devotion, in the way they worked hard for their families, in the way they understood that true love was not just a feeling, but an action, a choice made every day to put someone else's happiness before your own. The story of the stove became more than just a tale of one man's devotion. It became a symbol of what love could be, what it should be. It reminded people that grand gestures mattered, that showing someone you loved them through actions as well as words was important. It inspired countless others to make their own sacrifices, large and small, for the people they loved. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Jacob and Margaret were together still, their love undiminished by time or death. Perhaps they sat on a porch looking out at eternal mountains, or walked hand in hand through meadows that never faded. Perhaps they laughed together at how their simple story had touched so many lives, or marveled at the family they had created that stretched on through generations. But wherever they were, whatever form existence took after death, they were together. Because love like theirs did not end. It could not end. It was eternal, as permanent and enduring as the mountains Jacob had climbed, as warm and nourishing as the pies Margaret had baked. The stove had been a symbol, but the love was real. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the iron or the mountain, not the difficulty or the pain, but the simple, profound truth that Jacob and Margaret had loved each other with everything they had, and that love had made their lives and the lives of everyone they touched infinitely richer. Their story lived on, passed down through generations, told in books and articles, remembered in the quiet moments when people thought about what love really meant. Every time someone heard it, every time someone stood in front of that old iron stove and marveled at the man who had carried it up a mountain, a little bit of Jacob. And Margaret's love was rekindled, burning bright and warm, a flame that would never go out. This was their legacy. Not wealth or fame, not monuments or power, but love. Pure, strong, enduring love. The kind of love that could carry impossible burdens, climb the steepest mountains, and last beyond the boundaries of mortal life. And in the end, as the sun set over the Colorado mountains one final time in this story, casting long shadows and painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the old cabin stood empty but not forgotten, the stove cold but not discarded, and the memory of Jacob and Margaret Thorne lived on, a testament to the power of love to transform ordinary lives into something extraordinary. Their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and all who came after carried that story in their hearts. They told it to their own children, passing down not just the tale but the understanding that love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth everything. They taught that when you found someone who made your life complete, you did whatever it took to make them happy, to build a life together, to create something beautiful out of nothing but devotion and hard work. The steep hill that Jacob had climbed was still there, worn by time and weather, but fundamentally unchanged. Hikers sometimes walked the trail, following in his footsteps, though none carried a burden like his. They would reach the site of the old cabin and stand where he had collapsed with the stove on his back, and they would feel a connection to something greater than themselves, to a love story that had become legend. Margaret's pies were still made by her descendants, using her recipes, baked in modern ovens, but remembering the old stove where it all began. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every special occasion, someone would make one of Margaret's pies and tell the story of how Jacob had made it all possible. The recipes were treasured family heirlooms, written in Margaret's own hand in a notebook that was carefully preserved and protected. And sometimes, on quiet winter nights when snow fell softly on the mountains and the world was hushed and peaceful, it seemed that you could almost smell fresh-baked pie on the wind, almost hear the echo of Jacob's deep laugh and Margaret's bright voice. The mountain remembered them, held their story in its ancient stone and towering pines, kept their memory alive in the very air and earth. This was how love conquered death. Not by defying it, not by raging against it, but by living so fully, so completely, so beautifully, that the impact rippled outward through time, touching lives that would never meet the people who had started it all. Jacob and Margaret had lived ordinary lives in many ways, in a small cabin on a mountain, raising children and teaching school and baking pies. But they had loved extraordinarily, and that made all the difference. Their story was simple. A man carried a heavy iron stove up a steep hill so his wife could bake warm, sweet pies. But within that simplicity was contained every truth about love that mattered. It was about sacrifice and devotion. It was about knowing what made your partner happy and moving heaven and earth to provide it. It was about building a life together, creating a home, raising a family with love and care. It was about enduring through hardship and finding joy in simple things. It was about two people choosing each other every single day and making that choice mean something through their actions. And so the story ended where it began, with a mountain man and an iron stove and a steep hill. But it also never ended, because true love never does. It continued in every descendant who loved their spouse well, in every pie baked with care, in every sacrifice made gladly for another's happiness. It continued in the hearts of everyone who heard the story and was inspired to love more deeply, to try harder, to never give up on the people who mattered most. Jacob had carried that stove up the mountain over a century ago, but the love that motivated him was still alive, still burning bright, still warming hearts and inspiring souls. And as long as there were people who believed in love, who were willing to climb their own mountains for those they cared about, Jacob and Margaret's story would never truly end. It would live on, eternal and unchanging, a beacon of hope and a reminder that love, true love, was worth any price, any effort, any sacrifice. The warm, sweet pies were just pies. The iron stove was just a stove. The steep hill was just a hill. But together, they were so much more. They were the physical manifestation of love itself, proof that devotion could overcome any obstacle, that one person's happiness could be worth any amount of effort, that building a life with someone you loved was the greatest adventure of all. And that was the end of the story. And yet also just the beginning, because stories like this never truly end. They echo forward through time, inspiring and encouraging, reminding us all of what matters most. Love endures, love conquers, love transforms, and sometimes love carries a 300-pound iron stove up an impossible mountain just to see the joy in someone's eyes when they bake their first perfect pie.